Modern slavery. You'd know it if you saw it, right? Especially if it was under your nose and on your watch. In fact, you're certain that there are no instances of modern slavery in your supply chain because you've safeguarded against that terrible reality. You've got procedures in place. But do you really know what your supplier's supplier is up to? Given that 40.3 million people are victims of modern slavery across the world, it's quite possible that you don't. Finding instances of slavery somewhere along the supply chain is the stuff of every procurement pro's worst nightmare. But the stats don't lie. And that's why it's so important for procurement teams around the world to accept and address the problem in order to put this abhorrent practice to bed for good. Hello, I'm Tanya Siri, founder of Procurious. Welcome to today's webinar, Procurement Unchained, a Procure with Purpose webinar on modern slavery. I'm joined today by Padmini Ranganathan, Global Vice President, SAP Ariba, Fiona David, Executive Director, Global Research, Walk Free Foundation, and Alyssa Vosnia, Manager Risk Consulting, KPMG. Padmini is leading the charge for risk and sustainability products at SAP Ariba, innovating on solutions with key partners who provide insights that identify the materials, regions, and suppliers where risks like forced labour is most prominent, and providing companies with the intelligence and actionable workflows that enable them to do something about it. Fiona leads the Walk Free Foundation's research on modern slavery in 167 countries. She has worked with governments across the globe and advised several UN organisations on developing stronger responses to modern slavery. Alyssa works to devise bespoke solutions and products for risk assessment and integrity due to due diligence programs, with a specialised approach to anti-bribery and corruption, the UK Modern Slavery Act and supply chain risk. Welcome all. Padmini, I'd like to come to you first to kickstart our discussion today. SAP Ariba is doing a lot of work to encourage procurement professionals to procure with purpose, and a big part of this is tackling modern slavery within our supply chains. Why has this become such a big focus for you, and how did you first get involved?
Hi, thank you, and it's nice to be here. My personal story seems to be one of multiple tracks colliding towards this common path and journey. It sounds philosophical, but it's true. Growing up in India, I studied commerce and supply chain with a focus on cost management and global trade. Now, within that focus, of course, I learned what it takes for commerce to flourish, trade to happen, cost savings to be got, and efficiencies to be gained in supply chain. And then when I started to work, I naturally progressed towards technology and computers because that was the big industry that was kicking off in Bangalore, where I grew up. When I got involved in a technology company and my life became a bit more, financially viable for myself to start focusing on other things, I volunteered with a nonprofit called India Literacy Project outside of my work. And through that initiative, I got involved with projects that we were supporting, bringing child laborers to bridge schools and to formal schools, and taking them out of labor into a path towards literacy and livelihood. And that gave me a firsthand look at the issues on the ground, and really the critical issues where it's not about taking the children out of child labor, because if you do that just without any other focus, then you're actually taking away food from the entire family for a couple of days or multiple days, and that is not sustainable. So it was really what is that full picture that makes this happen. Now, I was living in the corporate world and working on supply chain and technologies and procurement technologies. And so it made me think about how can we apply technology to literally connect all of the stakeholders that are needed to solve the bigger picture of which will then enable these children to be moved out of child labor over time without impacting their food and their bellies and their family. So it was about a connected concept of what technology can do to connect all of these different variable factors together, which personally got me interested. Coming to SAP and SAP Ariba, as a technology company, it's one of the few companies that I have seen or worked with that has such a critical focus on connectedness, networks. And what I saw with the technology that we were building is that now this is finally possible. So the opportunity for taking that dream that I had developed when I was working at the nonprofit world, which was, again, a volunteering service that I was doing outside of work, and bringing it in and bringing that experience in to leverage the technology that we were building and having to leverage big data, to leverage artificial intelligence and all of these technological concepts together with a network to really provide that connectedness. And that opened my eyes to the opportunity we could have to expose the risks that exist, drive awareness. And, SAP Ariba has been a great place, both from the investments it puts into marketing to drive awareness all the way to the product technology that we build. And so running a product engineering team allows me gives me the license, if you will, to build something that is really important and critical, like awareness and exposure of forced labor risks.
Padmini, that is a fantastic story, and what a great position to be in for your personal passion, and then to be working in a company that could support that and actually drive change with something tangible. So that's fantastic to kick off. Alyssa, maybe if we move to you to get your thoughts on why there is such a growing focus on modern slavery today.
Well, thanks, Tanya. I think there are a number of key factors that are underlying increasing focus on modern slavery, but actually just listening to Padmini now, I think the factors I'm about to list really fall into one big theme, and that's around changing mindsets. So for instance, yesterday marked the 5th anniversary of the Rana Plaza collapse in Bangladesh, and that's a tragedy that really put the abhorrent worker conditions in Bangladesh and other similar countries under the spotlight, and in essence forced major Western brands and retailers to act in a way that they haven't before. So it showed that it was no longer business as usual to turn a blind eye to situations like this. And as a result of this, and a combination of everything else that was happening in industry, there's a threefold impact. So one of them is around consumers. So consumers are no longer concerned only with price and brand. We're actually seeing a big change, some of it generational, for people looking to purchase from businesses that closely reflect their own ethical values. And as I mentioned, it's a generation issue. It's more salient at this point with the millennials, who I would say very much vote with their wallet, right? So if they don't believe that where they shop is somewhere that produces clothes ethically, or shoes, or whatever it is that they're buying, electronics, they will look to other brands that more closely reflect this point of view. But it's not just about consumers, it's about companies themselves. They're much more aware about protecting their brand and their reputation. And that's because there's a real commercial consequence or consequences that can include loss of investment, and some investors are now using an ethical approach, an ethical lens is one of the critical indicators to see where they want to place their money. It's an ability to attract top talent, again, whether it's the millennials or people who, again, want to align their values with those of the companies and really believe in that, wanting to go to work and see that reflected every day in what they do, as Padmini was just describing, in terms of the changes that she's made. And then there's the loss of sales, as just mentioned, from the consumer part. And then we also have kind of a third force in this. We shouldn't forget about governments, right? And governments are picking up the call to action and driving ethical business conduct regulation. And it's not just around modern slavery, actually. In the last, I would say, 5 to 6 years, you're seeing regulation around anti-bribery and corruption, corporate tax evasion, so non-financial reporting focusing on environmental and social and governance issues. So there's a broader story to be told around what's happening with the ethical business conduct, and modern slavery, or the focus on modern slavery is a part of it. And having spoken about kind of the external pressures, I think it's quite important for us to think about the pressure from within businesses themselves, businesses that are looking to transform. So we are seeing this change, some of it incremental, some of it transformational when we speak to our clients, and admittedly, different paces and more reluctance from some. So there are exogenous and internal forces that are driving these changes and are using the lens of modern slavery to really reflect on what's happening from an ethical perspective.
Oh, that's a fantastic overview, Alyssa. You know, we've got the consumer, the corporation, and of course government. And it might be a good time now that you've given that great context, to actually ask Fiona to give us a brief overview of the realities and the prevalence of modern slavery in today's world.
It's a shocking reality that in 2018 we have some 40.3 million people living in modern slavery globally. Now, of course, it's very easy to get lost in those big numbers. 40.3 million, what is that? Twice the population of Australia, certainly the population of many European countries. So I find it particularly helpful to think about how does that relate to different sectors? How does that relate to individuals? How does that play out differently for men and women? Walk Free Foundation undertook the global estimates of modern slavery with the International Labour Organisation and International Organisation for Migration in 2007. And the global estimates gave us some of the best data that's available internationally on what the problem looks like right across the world. One of the first things that we noticed was the gender implications of the data. 71% of the victims of this crime are women and girls. So that's pretty extraordinary. We're here today on an all-female panel. I think we can all resonate with how significant that is. We also noticed that gender played out differently in terms of the sectors where people were being exploited and abused. So for men and boys, they were sectors that I think are very relevant to procurement professionals. The top three were construction, manufacturing, and agriculture and fishing. So really, that's really your three largest industries across the spectrum. For women and girls, it was primarily food services, domestic work, and the sex industry. So, of course, some of those industries are less relevant to procurement professionals buying goods and services on a daily basis, but I think you'd have to agree that construction and manufacturing and agriculture and fishing is going to be relevant to most people. I also mentioned that when we're talking about big numbers like 40 million people in modern slavery, it can be hard to get a handle on that and what that means. So I like to bring that back to the people that behind those numbers. Every one of those 40 million people has a family, might have children, might have sisters, might have brothers, things they're trying to achieve in their life. And just one example from my own experience, a young man by the name of Joe. That's not his real name, but I'll call him Joe for today's purposes. He came over from the Pacific Islands to Australia when he was about 16 or 17 years old, encouraged over by a friend of a family friend to come and work in Australia in the construction industry. Long story short, he ended up living in a house with 6 other young men working for this one particular man. They were all working on construction sites. They weren't being fed properly. They weren't being paid. They were literally going to building sites, working and, as we call it in Australia, bumming food off other people on the building sites because that's how hungry they were. And if one of them misbehaved, the others would have to punish him under the instruction of the man who was controlling them. Now, this particular young man, Joe, he was so physically and mentally damaged by the time he managed to escape from this situation. The violence against him had been so repeated that by the time he left, he had a brain injury and he was blind in one eye. So this is a strong young man coming from the Pacific Islands, coming over to Australia to a not an industry where you might think modern slavery would occur, to the construction industry. And by the end of it, he was left literally with disabilities.
Given there are 40.3 million people who are victims of modern slavery, there's a real chance that some of our listeners today might work for organisations who have slavery present somewhere in their supply chains. It's particularly difficult when it comes to monitoring the many levels of the supply chain. So what can procurement professionals do to identify instances of modern slavery within their supply chains? How will they recognise it?
The question of how procurement professionals can actually identify instances of modern slavery is really one that we have to think about on two levels. I think Elisa and Padmini have given lots of information, lots of very practical examples of how procurement professionals go about their daily business, whether it's with risk assessment or using data or different ways of setting up their supply chains. I think what I can contribute is really just encouraging people to look around them and literally listen and pay attention. As Elisa said, you've got a lot of information at your fingertips from your business. So you've already got information in front of you that's telling you stories. It's very unlikely that you're going to go into a factory or you're going to go into a clothing manufacturing place, or you're going to go into some sort of workplace and find people, locked in cupboards or chained to workstations, or, any of those very sort of traditional stereotypical ideas of modern slavery. What's far more likely is that you'll start to see patterns of risk that just send up a bit of a red signal for you. It could be some very simple things. You notice that something that you're purchasing is being produced in the Middle East. Well, is it being produced by migrant workers in the Middle East? Well, if it is, good chance they don't have their passports. It could be something else that triggers something for you. You realise the discrepancy shows that your supplier's supplier is actually obviously outsourcing to a third party who's then outsourcing to a third party. You could find this out from a customer complaint, or, there could be many ways you could find it out. But just be really curious about those risk signals and take the time to follow them through and look at the patterns, because it's really the patterns that are probably what you're going to see. Patterns like migrant workers paying a lot of money before they even come onto a site just to get an interview, just to get a job, or finding that workers are not being paid on time. Or even I've seen also patterns of quite extreme sexual harassment and, sexual discrimination. So I think if you're seeing workplaces that have got poor practices around things like sexual harassment, like safety, like occupational health and safety, have a look to see what else is going on from a broader human rights perspective.
A lot of companies focus on compliance issues when it comes to tackling modern slavery. Alyssa, what are you telling your clients in terms of why this is such an important issue to take seriously? And is there even a competitive advantage for some companies in this?
That's a really good question. As you can imagine, as a professional services company working with clients, we do get a lot of questions around the balance between commercial versus compliance. And I would say that's always been a very challenging issue to manage within businesses, especially for those with a global footprint where you see an increase in regulation across different countries that sometimes can actually conflict with each other. So how do you make your business work within that regulatory landscape? So we do see companies sometimes struggle to manage their business KPIs, looking at increasing sales, return on investment, and maximizing profit with growing compliance obligations. And I'll be honest, many of the clients that we speak to see compliance as a burden sometimes, or a box-ticking exercise to get out of the way before they can actually do their job and get on with their business. But what we're seeing as well, and this is to go back to the idea of changing mindsets, is that many companies, or maybe some, but an increasing amount, are seeing that there's a win here. There's a strategic approach to be taken when looking at modern slavery, or overall trying to understand the complexity and transparency, and really the quality of your supply chain, which is what modern slavery really touches on. And what we're seeing companies do is using the budget and the momentum of a mandatory regulatory deadline to go beyond a tactical fix and address broader related priorities and business challenges. So to give you an example around modern slavery specifically, as you review a supply chain as part of the Modern Slavery Act obligation, you can find efficiencies and shorten the supply chain as a result, reducing the risks to the business. But you can also have the other side of the coin where you find that you have too many key dependencies and actually you need to diversify your supply chain. So there's a lot of insight to be gleaned around your business by undertaking kind of the obligations within the different compliance aspects that are coming your way as a result of regulation. It doesn't have to be a disruption. It could be something that will allow your company to innovate. So in addition to strategy, some of the other things that we talk to clients about is the other things I've stressed already, right? So reputation, it's hard to put an estimate on the cost of reputational damage. So that's something you definitely need to consider. Ability and likelihood to win contracts around ethical investment, getting the best people from the employment pool, increasing your sales. And I also think it's very important to really understand who you're doing business with. So part of the exercise of making your supply chain transparent or understanding is that you actually see who you're working with and whether any of those relationships need changing or need to have a different focus, or you need to have a conversation with your suppliers. And I think what I've been circling around on this whole point is that actually you have a lot of information about your business, about your supply chain, about your customers that you can use to your advantage rather than disadvantage as a result of your compliance obligations. So use your data analytics to innovate and to have that competitive advantage to when you're competing in fairly tight margins and in an industry where sometimes it's very difficult to tell competitors apart.
Alyssa, you've given some great examples there of why and how companies can be proactive in this area. Fiona, I'd be interested to hear your views on what preventative measures can businesses put in place in terms of risk assessment and monitoring of suppliers.
Businesses have a lot of information at their disposal these days that they can draw on for their risk assessment processes. It includes things like the Walk Free Foundation Global Slavery Index. You can download all of our data for free from the website. It includes things like the United States Department of Labour list of products produced by forced labour. Again, you can download that data for free. So increasingly companies have got information at their fingertips that they can download, that they can start putting into matrices. So you might look at country risk, product risk, supplier characteristics, and then that really just gives you the basics of the risk assessment. In terms of knowing who you're dealing with, that was an issue that Elisa talked about. What I would add to that is think broadly about how people are coming into contact with your business. If you are buying things from a supplier, for example, that employs a lot of migrant workers, then I would be starting to think about risk, not just from the perspective of risk in that factory, but how they get to that factory. Where are those migrant workers being recruited? Who are they paying? What are they being told? Who's got their documents? And so on and so forth. So I'd really broaden the scope of your risk assessment, not just to the sites where you're having things produced, but how people are getting to those sites and the sorts of conditions that they're coming onto those sites with. Beyond some of the risk assessment and the information, I think it's really encouraging that a lot of businesses are starting to be much more proactive. We've talked about co-op, giving jobs to survivors. I'm working with another company at the moment that's funding its own research program to do a baseline of child labour and modern slavery in the sectors that it works in. So, really, one of the things that business is great about is being creative and finding solutions. There's lots of resources out there, and I think there's lots of opportunities to go forth and pave new ways of finding solutions to these problems.
Padmini and Alyssa, do you have any examples of organisations you've worked with that really inspire you with their approach to removing slavery from their supply chains? Padmini, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So We work with a lot of industries in SAP Ariba. In fact, that's our go-to-market strategy across SAP, and that allows us the opportunity to really look at how industries have been changing over time. The good thing with media is it exposes what is wrong. That really prompts industries to make a change. So if you look at the high-tech industry that we are part of, the industry has been faced with conflict minerals problems early on. So I've seen the opening up of information around electronics and electronic categories of goods to really start to share, what can be tracked from a transparency perspective, but without really giving up that competitive edge that Elisa was talking about. So that's been going on for now over 10 to 12 years, and so it's definitely changing, possibly longer than that. But I have been tracking it for a decade or so. Financial services companies, banks. It's unbelievable how many banks work with local businesses and small businesses and suppliers to provide mentorship, training, and business development support, in addition to the financing business that they operate. So it's not just about setting up your own business or financing and of course generating the profits for the bank, but then it is the much needed auxiliary or augmented support for small businesses and even new entrepreneurs in hard to reach areas. And that's something that has been very inspiring to see, that more and more financial services companies are taking on that opportunity to service their customers, including the small businesses and new entrepreneurs. And they're forming groups and they're forming, economic development initiatives, funding that, incubator startup, groups and hubs. So that's been a really big eye-opener for us to see how you could actually participate in co-development. And that's the common theme. Alicia touched upon the consumer industry and the consumers demanding that visibility and change, and that's gone a long way too. A consumer goods forum has recently released their directive or principle around forced labor. And that's a really good sign that as a consortium, as a group of companies in a particular industry, what could you do? So this industry has actually taken a stance that they will go beyond traditional compliance approaches and show genuine social stewardship. And so if we look at what that means, it's about companies treating and suppliers treating the people that work for them with fairness and dignity, which is a basic human right. So if you take palm oil as an interesting example, palm oil has a repercussion beyond just human beings, which is why the World Wildlife Fund and the UN Development Program are heavily involved in correcting the situations around the palm oil industry. That doesn't mean that the trade or the business and the livelihood opportunity should be taken away. Instead, it should be a more conscious shift from the impact the industry has had both on people and on wildlife, and really taking that to the next level of how do we work towards a common development goal. So companies partnering with World Wildlife Fund and with UN Development Program, so the NGO sector, the influencing sector, the local victim rehabilitation centers, that's actually possible. So what I'm seeing across these industries is that companies are going beyond code of conduct. There's actually a huge initiative which also represents why I'm seeing so much of a demand for the products that we've created, where there is a focus on high risk. So starting with that awareness of what those categories, locations, et cetera, are, which is where the use of technology comes in, because there's a lot of information out there. And there are lots of data from media, NGOs, et cetera, that can be harnessed to really build that visibility and transparency that Alicia was talking about. And analytics has come of age. So absolutely possible to do with technology. But as I was mentioning, these companies, in terms of best practices, are going beyond code of conduct. They're going beyond contract enforcement to really relationship building and partnerships. So the ecosystem of partnerships is going beyond the suppliers that they work with and to NGOs in the community, and leveraging that purchasing power to not just focus on cost savings, but actually focus it on some of the auxiliary services that they could provide to co-develop these suppliers. So on-site partnerships for policy implementation and audits, that cannot be replaced, because building a trusted community and relationship is about people connection, no matter how much technology there's out there. But technology does help with data transparency and sharing across for industry and public good. So suppliers, for example, the small businesses out there who are doing good should be given the freedom to share their best practices. I think we have done a lot of siloed damage with technology to silo data and create a lot of protective barriers. Now, don't get me wrong, the privacy barrier is very important, but there should be aspects of data that can be shared for public good. And there is so much technology around anonymization that can be used for doing that. So personally, I would like to redefine responsible sourcing. And working with all of our customers of SAP Ariba, I draw inspiration from many companies who are making that internal change, moving from cost savings to utilizing sustainability factors, including social sustainability factors like human rights or wage rights or worker voice as areas of, or levers, if you will, to make their sourcing decisions, to help the suppliers with co-development, really establishing that partnership with the suppliers, providing that provide those critical materials and services. That's the primary source of profits for these large corporations. And so redefining responsible sourcing to not just be a check the box questionnaire survey approach, but actually how do you participate in that supplier co-development and measure that? So those are the best practices I have seen, and redefining responsible sourcing is really what it's all about.
Wow, that certainly sets the bar, sort of more of a regulatory approach to relationships. Padmini, that's hopefully inspiring for a lot of our listeners. Lisa, what are you seeing out there in best practices? And I guess too, Padmini, it's great to hear the financial services are sort of leading the way. That I wasn't aware of that. So, Alyssa, what are you seeing?
Well, it sounds like, what I see as best practice across different industries is very similar to what Padmini has just described, right? And it's the idea it's a transformational piece. It's redefining what we think is our responsibilities as companies and consumers. So as part of the work that we do in KPMG and around Modern Slavery Act and other bits of ethical business conduct, we've spoken to a number of clients. And for me, there are two types of companies that I see leading in this space. So for instance, I've mentioned Rana Plaza. So the companies who had either gone through a reputationally damaging event like that, and then use that type of event as a galvanizing force to transform their business to align with ethical conduct. That's one that we're seeing making a change. So actually a lot of that you will see around the retail space, right? So a lot of companies who are in Rana Plaza had to make pretty substantial changes as a result of that. But also more recently you had the Panorama program talking about Syrian refugee children working in a Turkish retail manufacturing factory. So, and there was a different response from the companies that were discovered to be using the supplier who was actually employing these, well, I wouldn't say employing, I guess having the refugee children work there. But then the other type of organization are the ones that have built ethical business conduct into their actual business. So basically what Padmini is just talking about, which is a result from the basis of their competitive advantage. And these are the companies that I see time and time again leading the way in addressing the risks of modern slavery in their supply chain. So I think I'd like to reflect on an example of, I guess, one of my favorite clients that I have worked with in this space, and they're a global manufacturing client, which is unusual because normally, you would see some movement in the financial services sector because there's a huge regulatory push there, but also in B2C because there is a consumer aspect, and there's a bit of a slower response from B2B companies because the pressure there is slightly less, and that's actually what we've picked up in the industry as well. So in this way already we were seeing some pretty serious push from this company in moving forward on this issue, and they really embedded sustainability and integrity into the core of the business. But when we worked with them, when we worked with this client in helping them meet their obligations under Modern Slavery Act, we found that they had really fantastic ideas and approaches, but which were very much siloed across the separate functions. Padmini mentioned the siloing of data. So this was the siloing of expertise that could really help, empower the ethics of the business model. So what we did with them, we did a number of things, but one of the, key things was getting all the important stakeholders around the table and actually having that conversation, facilitating the discussion related to modern slavery across their functions. It really helped bring out the best practice that was already existing across the business. So we found out one function was actually absolutely smashing it, leading the way on their risk assessments, on their due diligence, and how they engaged with suppliers. Like, they really got it, right? And actually, you didn't have to bring in consultants to do this for them. That existed already. And it was fantastic for that knowledge share to occur with some help from us. Also, we help them think strategically about the ethics of their work, right? So you can have the best policies and procedures in place, but as I mentioned, if your overall KPIs conflict with these ethics, so the reduction of cost, what are you actually going to be able to do effectively? One of the things that really moved the needle for me on this business is their passion about engaging with their suppliers. So it wasn't just about understanding the risks and looking at their supply chain, having this risk management approach. It was thinking about, as Padmini mentioned, having these collaborative platforms. What could they do better? Growing their role as, a key stakeholder for their suppliers, because they worked in an industry where there's a lot of vulnerability to the supply chain, so they couldn't necessarily go out and get a new supplier if there was an issue with one of theirs, right? So they actually had to work with the supplier to educate them. And often they were working with suppliers in countries all over the globe, so very different regulatory landscapes, very different cultures as well in that relation. But they were really passionate about actually doing this and not shying away from a fairly difficult job. And I suppose the key here is changing the culture, not just the process. So the culture within the business, and I think that was already there. It was the tone at the top, but also people were buying into this message. They were buying into it across the business, and also they were happy to cascade that and to work with their suppliers around the culture piece. So these examples that are straight from this client, but I'm really describing what I would see as best practice across different industry. And I think another critical aspect, which is not necessarily part of what I've seen with a client, but what I see across industry is really taking on the responsibility of what happens, once that breach occurs, but once modern slavery is uncovered, and we actually have to remediate this and be there to support the people who have been victims of modern slavery. So for me, reading about co-op supporting modern slavery victims by creating jobs and leading, I think it's called the Bright Future campaign, and creating 300 jobs by 2020, or a situation for example, some of the companies that were discovered to have refugees in the Turkish factory. Some of the responses were, so what? I guess we need to deal with this, but maybe we'll give it some thought, but not. And others, I think ASOS specifically, checking themselves and saying, okay, well, right, this has happened. This is what we're going to do to actually deal with the situation. But in the meantime, we are dealing with real people. It's not just a process. So this is how we're going to support the people who have been victims of modern slavery within this factory. So that is an important, and it's not just optics, it's an understanding of what that means. And it's nice to see that this is cascading and it's actually going out and gaining momentum in the industry.
Alyssa, I might jump in there and actually ask you to talk about the UK Modern Slavery Act. I mean, we've given some great examples here of companies that have gone beyond compliance, but, the UK Act is probably one of the best known pieces of legislation of its type in the world. Can you give it a sort of a brief outline of what it contains and how it compares to other legislation in the world?
Sure. So actually, as you said, the UK Act is one of the best known in the world, and it's mold breaking in the sense of what is put down in law, and what you expect to see across different parts of it. So there's business, and obviously there's the criminal offences. Obviously, our focus is on business, what we do at KPMG, which is Section 54 of the Act. And there's quite a bit of guidance around it, but on paper, actually, if you look at the letter of the law, it's quite basic, right? Because all you have to do to stay compliant is to make a report about the steps that you've taken to mitigate slavery, place it on a prominent place in your website, and have it signed by a director equivalent. So actually, there's not a lot you need to do to be compliant. It's more around the reputational piece around it. So a lot of the companies that we engage with, that we speak to, think about it as the spirit of the law rather than the letter. And as a result of this is where you're seeing all these different policies and procedures being put into place, risk assessments and due diligence and training. And most companies go far beyond what is that, I wouldn't say dictated, but what is set out formally in the law itself, and really support kind of the different, kind of the aspirational obligations that are set out in the guidance. But as you said, this is not the only piece of legislation that we're seeing that touches on modern slavery, and actually the MSA has led the way in many ways, and there are now laws around modern slavery that are in the process of being implemented and put into legislation in the Netherlands, in Hong Kong, in the US, although I'm not sure of the success of this, and most prominently in Australia. But also you have the California Transparency and Supply Chain Act, which has been around since 2012, and in some ways set the precedent for what's been happening in the UK.
Well, Alyssa, given you've mentioned Australia, we might throw to Fiona, because I understand Walk Free has done a lot of work tracking the Modern Slavery Act. What is your opinion on its impact?
Debates around the introduction of a Modern Slavery Act, and particularly introduction of supply chain transparency for businesses, has really opened up a new and important conversation in Australia. Previously, we've seen all of the action on this issue being undertaken by the government, and sometimes by the government with civil society, or civil society also acting on its own. What the Modern Slavery Act discussion has done is brought business to this table. It would have been unthinkable 5 years ago to have an event on modern slavery where there would be business representatives there, whereas today, at any event I'm going to, you might have representatives from ANZ, Rio Tinto, Fortescue Metals Group, BHP, different very, very large businesses coming along, in addition to the government stakeholders, in addition to the civil society stakeholders. And importantly, they've all got different strengths, and they've got a different role to play. So I think even before we get the Act, just the conversation that started in itself is really important. The other thing I think is really important about the Modern Slavery Act conversation in Australia is the focus that we've had on the idea of getting an independent anti-slavery commissioner, such as has been put in place in the United Kingdom. We know that many countries have laws, lots of people have tried to fix this issue before, but of course the devil is in the detail, and it always comes down to implementation. Well, an anti-slavery commissioner is the person who can focus on implementation, and is the person who can help identify where the blockages and the breakdowns are in the system of responding to this issue.
Fiona, almost every country in the world has some laws against modern slavery, as Alyssa was just talking about. But that doesn't mean all governments are actually holding businesses to account or are implementing acts with punitive measures that require businesses to actually act. Why do you think this is the case?
I would even go one step further than that. Not only are some governments not holding businesses to account, there are actually some governments where it is the government who is the problem, who is literally the perpetrator of forced labour. So we know from our research that there's something like 20 countries around the world where it is the government itself that is implicated in state-sponsored forced labour. So we see this whether it's North Korea, we see this with North Korean workers working throughout Europe, we see this in parts of Africa. So, governments, it's very important to look to governments for solutions, but sometimes they can be as much part of the problem as part of the solution. In terms of, most of the governments of the world that are trying to make an effort on this issue, that have, made laws, that have made policies, that are trying to encourage people to do the right thing, the reality is that some of the risk factors for modern slavery are also the very factors that mean laws don't get enforced. So things like corruption, weak justice systems, high levels of discrimination that mean some people can access justice and some can't. So unfortunately, each of those is a risk factor for modern slavery occurring, but it's also a systemic reason why justice is often very far away for people. So one of the important things with modern slavery is to really understand that we're talking about a problem that is facilitated by corruption, by poor rule of law, by conflict, by discrimination, and we are just scratching the surface. So with the 40 million people that we know are affected by modern slavery, in any one year, about 60,000 people are identified as victims by the authorities globally. So think about that discrepancy. 40 million people affected by this crime, 60,000 people identified and given help. So there is a huge iceberg beneath the surface that we haven't even begun to find yet. So I really think it's incumbent on governments, it's also incumbent on businesses and all of us to really get out there and do a better job of looking and finding this problem.
Padmini, what are your thoughts on this? Based on your experiences working in the United States, do you think we need better or different legislation?
I'm not an expert on regulations or government, but what I see, and I am from California, so I've seen the California Transparency Act come to bear in 2012, so within this decade. But what I've also seen is, yes, on one hand, these regulations and the fact that governments are coming together and putting this requirement on companies to be more transparent is a good thing, because it at least raises awareness and it raises the bar for companies to actually focus on this issue, because it's very easy otherwise, I think, to sort of hide under the legal protection barrier of profits, and that's the only way I can call it, because under the veneer of having to report quarter-over-quarter profits just to keep your, of course, very important part, to keep your shareholders happy and your customers happy, it is also imperative on these companies to take it upon themselves, and again, I go back to responsible sourcing, to do the responsible sourcing. So what I've seen with the government legislations is it's enforcing that action by companies, because while, as Alicia said, there is no real enforcement that I am seeing, but there is, once there is a knowledge of something going on, then I do see that in the U.S. There's capabilities of the state level to really tackle it and hopefully bring about that change. So companies that engage in manufacturing and retail and have to do the verification of product supply chains. They have to conduct audits. They maintain accountability standards. What I'm not seeing is that these are enforced. It's pretty much up to the company to provide a report, any number of pages. I really wonder if those reports are being read by anyone beyond the first few pages. Wonder if any actions being taken on things that have not moved, for example. So is it just sufficient to generate reports after reports every year to say we are working on it? So I'm not sure that's sufficient, but I really don't know enough about legislation and public policy to figure out what else can be done. So ultimately, I think it's the corporations taking that accountability, and I've seen that coming up over and over again. In the life sciences industry recently, the Nagoya Protocol, is a great example of, yes, they were talking about biodiversity, but in talking about biodiversity, they also included the concept of fair and equitable sharing of the benefits arising from the use of those biodiverse genetic resources. So the fact that fair and equitable sharing of benefits all the way down to the worker is possibly the only way to for corporations and NGOs and communities and governments to come together and really make sure that there is a change, because reporting alone doesn't quite cut it, in my opinion.
Padmini, can you tell us about the role of technology and specifically what SAP Ariba is doing in this space?
Absolutely. The idea of, again, as I mentioned, technology taking all of that vast amounts of information and data that is coming at us in really in high frequency, the news feeds, the social media sentiments, the NGO reports, the actual violations and things being reported from the ground by many NGOs out there is now accessible data and information. So AI is a way to harness that data and put the right models around it. Things like clustering the information into something that's more relevant and meaningful for my business, for me, and my role in the business. It's a very, very important thing to do. So there's three things there. There is the harnessing and harvesting of that data that is coming in, so the data ingestion process that technology can support to do very, very quickly indeed. Minutes, seconds, the data can be harnessed and harvested. And then running it through models of artificial intelligence to cluster the data into meaningful nuggets, and clustering the data into meaningful nuggets to whom is the personalization layer, because technologies today exist to understand you as a person, what your role is, what your job is, what categories do you manage, what region and locations do you manage, what do you care about, etc. And that same technology that allows us to personalize information in the retail space can also be used to personalize information for corporate procurement professionals and supply chain professionals to really understand what's going on and act on it. Not act upon a hunch or not act upon hearsay, but really use facts and information to drive those assessments and audits, which cannot be really removed, but it can be much more targeted. And lastly, machine learning. It's only when the users start to use the machines and the human brains that are applied to that, then machine learning begins. So the adoption of these technologies, as that grows, we really hope to see machine learning kick in and start to provide those recommendations of best practices, which can be the shareable part of best practices that we can automate and make it more scalable and generate that momentum. So these are the areas that we are investing in and working on the capabilities to bring data to the person and then the person's actions to drive recommendations. So hopefully that helps.
And what about blockchain? I was reading a Forbes article about how you're using blockchain, or someone's using blockchain to eradicate slave labour in fishing industries in Thailand by tracking the fish from catch to consumer. Can this sort of technology or this approach be used throughout the supply chain to identify slavery?
The blockchain is an emerging technology. It's been used in the blood diamonds area pretty successfully. Applicability across other areas is possibly still to be proven. Like any other technology, it'll have its time to prove, time to scale, time to generate the value. So technology is only as good as the value it generates. And so with blockchains, what is the value it can generate is about how that data has come into that blockchain and how much trust do you have in that data that's come into the blockchain. And until that value is proven,
yes.
I wouldn't know whether blockchain would really be of use or not. But clearly it starts to connect the data. It starts to create the transparency. So I think there's a beginning there, but then the value is yet to be proven, in my opinion.
We're almost running out of time, so I'd like to ask each of you to answer this one final question. What would you say to our listeners and the wider global procurement community who might think this is either an issue that doesn't affect them or that there is nothing they can do to tackle this issue? Alyssa?
So from my point of view, I think every business is vulnerable to modern slavery risk, no matter how low risk you think your business model is in relation to this exposure. Our supply chains are far too global and complex to assume business as usual. But this risk is not insurmountable, and if you have a reliable toolkit, so some of the things we've talked about, the ethical policies and procedures, risk assessments, supplier audits, etc., to support your engagement with this issue and really think about it, you're already halfway there in mitigating this risk because you've taken the steps to understand it.
Padmini, what are your thoughts?
Three things really: become aware, source responsibly, and act now, take your individual action as a global procurement professional to really drive that influence, because even a reduction of 1 in modern slavery is huge for that family. And it's only those incremental improvements that can really generate the momentum. Little drops of water make a mighty ocean, or something like that, right? So that's really what I would hope every procurement professional can contribute.
That's right. Every category manager out there has the ability to really influence this and make an impact. So that's a great point. Fiona, what would be your takeaway messages?
My advice would be, if you look, you will find. If you have global supply chains that depend on logistics, you have risk. If you have global supply chains that depend on any form of construction, manufacturing, agriculture and fishing, you have risk. It's out there. It's really just a matter of opening your eyes, being open, being curious. Go look and you will find.
Thank you to all of our speakers today, Fiona, Padmini and Alyssa. If you'd like to listen to this webinar again or share it with your colleagues and peers, it will be available via the Procurious e-learning area from tomorrow afternoon. If you have any questions from our speakers, please don't hesitate to ask them in our discussion board, and we'll ensure it gets answered for you. I hope that today's webinar has encouraged you to learn more and do more to really impact change within your supply chains. Many thanks for joining us today.